hard to say.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you all for coming after what has been a very busy Horizon House day. We are privileged to have Emily Moore here to speak with us. She is, let's start with the credentials of, she went to Brown University, got her bachelor's degree there, went to Harvard Kennedy School and studied, got a master's in public policy there. She then moved on to doing a variety of things, a decade sort of in social sector kind of strategy and program things. She most recently was working for Dahlberg Advisors, where she had clients including the MacArthur Foundation, the UN Population Fund, First Lady Michelle Obama's program called Reach Higher, her initiative called Reach Higher, and other things. But she is now working as a senior researcher at Sightline Institute, and she is their specialist on the transition, how Cascadia can transition out of fossil fuels into climate-friendly ways of doing things. I think the only other thing to say is she has become a Northwesterner, although this is national. She's an enthusiast for pickleball.
I love pickleball. I only learned it when I moved to Seattle a couple years ago, and now I know it's our official state sport, I heard. Well, as Jean said, my name is Emily Moore. I am so happy to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me, and I've heard it's been a busy day. So I am grateful that you're making some time to talk about transmission lines and the electric power grid in the Northwest. I'm curious if folks have heard of Sightline. Maybe raise your hand. Oh, wow, great. So most people, which is great. For those who don't know, Sightline Institute is a nonprofit think tank, and we research some of the most pressing policy issues in the Northwest. Specifically, we look at climate, democracy, and housing. I know you all have had a number of Sightline speakers over the years, which is probably part of the reason that you're so familiar with Sightline. So I'm happy to be part of that tradition. Today I'm going to be talking about actually a brand new topic for Sightline, which is electric transmission. And by that I mean what you might be able to see here. This is a transmission line tower. And so transmission lines are those long, big power lines that you often see maybe along a mountain range or a river or maybe a highway, and they carry electricity across long distances. As I said, this is a new area, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts and questions at the end of the talk, and hopefully you'll be a little bit nice. I've heard that you are, so. This picture is at the start of Wallace Falls hike. I don't know if anyone has been here, but you may recognize it. If so, I took it a few months ago when I went on that hike, and when you go on that, you can hear the lines kind of buzzing. So I'll just quickly run through the agenda, what I'm going to talk through tonight. First, I'm going to share a little bit about why I'm even talking about transmission, and that is actually a good news story, so happy to start there. And then I'll go a little bit deeper into transmission itself and why it's so important, and some of the problems that we're having around that in the Northwest. Then I'll talk about what we can do about it, and again, I'll leave some time at the end for your questions and thoughts. And I know we have maybe some energy experts in the room, so eager to hear from you too. So, as some of you may know if you've heard of Sightline's work, we historically have focused on fighting fossil fuel projects in the Northwest. So for the last decade or so, tons of oil, coal, and gas projects have shown up on the shores of Cascadia and have threatened our climate progress here and abroad. This is an example of an oil train that derailed, and I believe this is in Canada. And so we fought long and hard with our allies, including tribes, activists, local elected officials, to say no to those projects. And that's been the bread and butter of our work at Sightline, as well as many in the regions who are focused on climate and a clean environment more broadly. Now, that work has actually been quite successful, which is wonderful. So one of the first things I did when I joined Sightline was actually looked at all of the projects that were proposed over the last decade in the Pacific Northwest, all of the fossil fuel export projects. And you can see from this chart that the vast majority of those proposed projects have since been canceled. So this chunk up here are all the projects that were canceled, and they were once proposed. And the different colors are the different types of projects. So you've got liquefied natural gas projects, coal, oil, propane, methanol. So most of them were canceled for a variety of reasons, but including opposition from people here who didn't want to see those. There's a handful that have not yet been canceled. You can see those ones down here. Most of them are actually up in British Columbia, and they're mostly liquefied natural gas projects. So that basically is taking fracked gas, liquefying it, and then shipping it. Only one of them has actually started construction so far, so we're still optimistic that actually a bunch of those will end up being canceled too. But why am I saying all this? By and large, this has been a great success, and we're starting to look at how do we not just say no to the polluting, dirty projects that have showed up here and that may continue to show up, but how do we also start to say yes to the clean energy infrastructure that is going to be critical to meeting the climate crisis? And one of the most important examples of that clean energy infrastructure is electric transmission. So again, here's another picture of transmission lines. Why is transmission so important for the clean energy transition? Again, there's some good news behind that story. These are just a few examples which I'll go through in terms of why we're talking about transmission today. One of the things is that renewable energy has, as I'm sure many know, gotten so much cheaper than fossil fuels in terms of what it costs to generate electricity. Building a new solar or wind farm is now 40% cheaper than building a new coal or gas plant for electricity. Solar costs have plummeted 90% in the last decade. Wind and battery costs have fallen by 2/3 in the same time period. So all of this was kind of unimaginable just a few years ago. And certainly, if you've seen in the news, there have been some rising costs with renewables recently. Just like everything else, they're not immune to inflation or supply chain constraints that we're seeing around the economy, but they're still way, way, way cheaper than fossil fuels. So that's a huge success and something that, again, wasn't the case not very long ago. So we've got this explosion, potentially, of new wind and solar projects that can be used to generate electricity. Second big win up here, as I'm sure everybody is very well aware, President Biden signed historic climate legislation into law just a few months ago, the Inflation Reduction Act, as it's called, which is going to direct $370 billion to clean energy infrastructure and other climate-related activities. Again, something that we maybe hadn't expected and had never seen before. We have never seen that level of federal investment in clean energy before in the United States. So huge potential here. And then closer to home in the Northwest, we have some really ambitious, some of the most ambitious climate policies in the country that we should be really proud of here. We also have climate leaders at the helm of our state governments. I'm sure folks were following closely some of the local races, and I think it's just to name one of the wins in Oregon with the governorship, that's going to protect some of Oregon's climate policies that could have been at risk. So a big sigh of relief there, and again, we have these amazing policies in place and a lot going well. But I guess here's where we get into transmission a little bit more, all this full potential risks being derailed if we don't build more transmission. So to understand why transmission is core to this, you have to think about the two main pillars of addressing climate change. One of them is that we need to clean up how we get our electricity, and then the second of them is that we need to electrify pretty much everything that can be electrified. So those are kind of the two core things we've got to do. Luckily, in Oregon and Washington, we've got laws on the books to do that first thing, clean up our electric sources. In Oregon, the legislature last year passed what's called HB 2021, which requires electric utilities to move away from generating electricity from fossil fuels, that means coal or gas, and toward generating it with wind and solar power or other carbon-free sources. We have a similar thing here in Washington, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which Governor Inslee signed into law in 2019. And it's also known as CETA. And we've got a similar set of laws and targets here. The core one is that by 2045, our electric utilities need to be 100% carbon-free. And we've got some interim targets up to that, including in just 3 years, 2025, we need to stop using coal to generate electricity. So these are ambitious and fantastic climate policies that kind of underpin a lot of the Northwest's climate ambitions. But they're also hugely ambitious laws and require big changes on the part of electric utilities. And I should clarify, they specifically apply to investor-owned utilities, so private utilities. There are public utilities and also municipally owned utilities. So Seattle City Light, for example, is not covered under this law because it's not an investor-owned utility. But the biggest utilities in Washington and Oregon are covered under these laws. And just to show you how big of a change this is going to be, and is already starting to be, this shows here Puget Sound Energy, which is the biggest electric utility in Washington state. And it shows what percentage of their electricity comes from each source. This is as of 2020. And half of their electricity, roughly, comes from fossil fuels. So down here at the bottom is the dark blue bar. That shows that 27% of the electricity comes from natural gas. Then we have hydro at green, and then here in the light blue, 23% at coal. Now here, these small bars at the top are how much electricity they're generating from wind and solar. So wind is the 9% in orange, and then you can probably not even see this purple 1% solar. Same story for Portland General Electric, which is Oregon's biggest electric utility too. So needless to say, this chart needs to look completely different in not very long. It needs to reverse all of these numbers. And what that means is that the electric utilities, they need to start shutting down their fossil fuel fired generating plants. So this is an example of a natural gas fired power plant. This one's, I think, in California, but just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. And they're going to have to increase, Puget Sound Energy, I believe, says to meet the Washington 2045 target, that they're going to have to increase their renewable resources by 500%. So it's a huge increase. Now, luckily, or I guess it's not luck exactly, it's a lot of intentional activity that's gone behind this. But we are seeing an explosion of wind and solar projects, especially in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. So this is the Wheat Ridge. I don't know if anybody has heard of this. It's a brand new renewable energy facility in Oregon that's actually the first in the country to combine wind, solar, and battery storage all on one site. And this just opened a couple months ago in Oregon. It's about 3 hours east of Portland, and it's owned by Portland General Electric. So this is just an example of the new types of projects that we're starting to see in the Northwest and around the country too. In Washington, we right now have only 2 solar farms. This is one of them. This is well, you can see these are wind turbines, but it's a solar and wind farm combined. And this one's owned by Puget Sound Energy. But there are 40, at least, solar farms being proposed right now. So a huge increase from the 2 that we have right now. So that's all great, but we don't right now have enough electric transmission to bring all of this new wind and solar power from where it's being generated to the people who need to use it, like us here in Seattle, or to the people in Portland, and most of the population centers and homes and businesses that are in the western part of the 2 states. So now I'm going to get a little bit deeper into transmission. So as I'm saying, transmission is the missing link in our clean energy transition. To understand a little bit better why, it's helpful to look at some maps. Don't worry about reading all of this. You don't need to do that to understand the message. But basically what this is it shows the solar potential of the Northwest and Intermountain region. So the dark red areas are where you have the stronger solar power, and then the lighter areas are where you have the less strong solar power. And you can see a pretty big divide along the Cascade Mountain Range, and then also stronger sun, of course, as you get farther south. And then the green blob up at the top, that's Puget Sound Energy's service territory. And the little dots you see and the little lines, those are where they currently generate electricity and their current transmission lines. It's the same thing with the purple for Portland General Electric. So you can see that they're very concentrated, of course, where their customers are. But what you don't see here, of course, is transmission lines that can reach all of that solar power. So the 2 biggest electric utilities in Washington and Oregon do not own transmission lines that can tap into that solar power. Same story with wind. So this is the exact same map, but just with wind. And again, the darker color is the stronger wind. And we have really strong wind, especially in Montana and Wyoming. And Washington State actually is really counting on Montana wind for our state energy strategy. I think they've estimated that 26% of Washington's electricity should come from Montana wind in the clean energy future, and right now it's barely anything. So a pretty mammoth change that we're talking about, and again, we don't have the electric utilities don't have the transmission lines to bring that electricity. So what are they doing? You're probably wondering. So this is where the story gets maybe a little bit more complicated or interesting, depending on your view. But this is where Bonneville Power Administration enters the story. So Bonneville Power Administration owns most of the transmission in the Pacific Northwest. This is an example of some of the transmission lines that they own. I think this is in Oregon. They're a entity within the Federal Department of Energy, and they were created during the New Deal. And they're most well known for their main mandate, which has been to sell the electricity that's generated on federally owned dams, or by federally owned dams, including on the Columbia River. So that's what they've been doing most of their existence. That's why they were created. They were also created to electrify rural areas in our region. But their lesser known role is that they actually own 75% of the transmission lines in the Pacific Northwest. So this map, all these purple lines are owned by Bonneville Power Administration. And you can see that they have obviously a much deeper penetration than the utilities do. And they also own particularly important lines going from east to west across the Cascade Mountain Range, which is kind of the critical path to bring all that electricity over to where most of the population lives. Now, so all the electric utilities, or not all of them, but most of them are saying, well, we want to tap into Bonneville's grid, as they've been doing already to some extent, to be able to use these wires and bring our electricity across as we're required to by law. The problem is that Bonneville's grid is pretty much already full. So BPA, every year it receives requests from utilities and from renewable developers to use its transmission lines, to get transmission service. It's been getting more and more requests every year. So you can see here in 2020, they got 62 requests. In 2021, they got 116 requests. And just this year, they got 144 requests. So it's increasing almost exponentially. And most of these requests in 2022 were for wind and solar projects, trying to tap into the grid. But as I was saying, the grid is mostly full. So they could only accommodate 11 of those 144 requests for quote-unquote long-term firm transmission. That is probably not worth getting into what long-term firm transmission is. It gets very wonky very fast. But what you need to know is that it's basically the gold standard of transmission. It guarantees that your resource will have transmission. It won't get cut off. So the main story here is that most of the requests are ending up in a wait list. So right now there are 600 unique requests for Bonneville's transmission services that are sitting in a wait list. Some of them have actually been there for about a decade. The problem is, and part of the reason for this backlog, is that BPA is pretty risk averse and it won't build ahead of guaranteed demand for the new line. So it creates this kind of chicken and egg problem where a renewable developer often needs to prove that they already have transmission rights secured in order to break ground on their project, but BPA won't build a new line unless they know for sure that a developer or utility is going to use the line. So we're in this kind of weird limbo right now. And a lot of people think that BPA should be building more lines and is the right actor to do it. I should say that they don't have to be the one to do it. You know, in other regions of the country, actually we're quite unique here in the Pacific Northwest that we have this federal entity that owns most of our transmission. That's not the case in most parts of the country. Usually it's utilities that own transmission lines. Sometimes it can be a private transmission owner that's not a utility. But people think that here, some people think that here, BPA makes sense to be building more lines because they have that huge footprint, unlike anybody else. They obviously built a lot and have the engineering expertise, and they have $17 billion in borrowing authority. And that actually increased by, I believe, $10 billion last year with the Infrastructure Act. Senator Maria Cantwell helped them increase their borrowing authority last year. So those are a lot of reasons that people give to say, well, why doesn't BPA take on a little bit more risk, get ahead of this demand that we know is coming, and build some more lines before the problem gets even worse? I forgot to mention earlier that transmission lines can take up to 10, even 20 years to build. That's an important fact. So we are running out of time. Just to put it in another way, how much power is waiting in line for BPA transmission. On the left-hand side, this is the gigawatt equivalent of those 600 requests that are sitting in the wait list. And then on the right-hand side, this is the total generating capacity of all of the existing power plants that we have already today in the Pacific Northwest. So all of the dams, the natural gas power plants, and this includes Idaho and Montana. So you can see, it's not quite equivalent, but just to give you a sense of the magnitude of power that is just waiting in the backlog, it's quite significant. Now, a lot of groups are starting to raise the alarm about this. This is a quote from somebody that I interviewed in my research. His name's Spencer Gray. He's the executive director of the Northwest and Intermountain Power Producers Coalition, which is also called NIPSI. And they're basically a membership organization of independent power producers. And he told me, this is what the quote says, We often disagree with utilities on procurement, but we are pretty much eye to eye with them on transmission. So it's creating some strange bedfellows of people who are saying, listen, we need more transmission, or those electricity laws that I mentioned earlier, some of those bedrock laws that we have in Oregon and Washington, those we're not going to meet the targets. Part of the reason that transmission lines take so long is that they can be quite controversial. So I'll just tell you a little bit about a line that was proposed by Portland General Electric in 2010. They proposed this project called the Cascade Crossing, and it would have run, you can see they had a couple of routes, but it would basically have run from Boardman to Salem. And they were saying that they needed this new line to bring wind energy across the Cascades. It's interesting to read, I think it's interesting to read this quote from one of the project managers on that project from 2010. So again, we're talking more than a decade ago. And this is what that person says at the time. He said, "Most opportunities for us," he means PGE, "to meet our renewable energy standard are in the eastern part of the state. Currently, eastern wind power is transmitted on an existing grid operated by Bonneville Power Administration. But those are becoming fully utilized." So this was already starting a decade ago. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that this specific transmission line was good or bad. I think things are more nuanced than that, and I don't have enough information to be able to say definitively. And as I was saying, transmission lines can be controversial, including this one. So this transmission line raised concern from a lot of different groups. One group was the Warm Springs tribes, so the part of the proposed path would have crossed over their reservation. It also would have crossed through 2 national forests, so people were worried about that. And people were also worried that it would be used to, I'll show you the map again, to bring coal-fired electricity from Boardman. Folks may know that the Boardman coal-fired power plant was just demolished, actually, I believe a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was a couple months ago, but recently. So that doesn't exist anymore. But there were concerns at the time that it would be used to transmit coal-fired electricity. So PGE actually did reroute the project to avoid the reservation in light of those concerns, and then it decided to cancel it in 2013. So that one never got built. And now there are basically no transmission lines being built right now. There is one, which is called the Boardman to Hemingway project, and it's owned by Pacific Core and Idaho Power. And it's going to bring, hopefully, wind power up to Boardman. And it just got a key permit from Oregon a couple weeks ago, so that looks like it's going to go forward. And this is this is just part of where it's going to go. This is part of its path. But again, it's not without controversy, and the sage grouse are at risk. They did develop a mitigation plan to try to avoid some of the most sensitive habitats, but there is kind of that concern as well with that project by some conservationists and environmentalists. So none of this is simple, as I'm sure you are well aware. Hopefully by now I have at least somewhat convinced you that electric transmission is the unsung hero of the clean energy transition, and that we need a lot more of it. But perhaps contrary to what you might expect me to say, I'm not going out there advocating that we need to build a bonanza of new lines everywhere. We should be thinking of transmission as one critical tool in our toolkit. There are others as well. One of them is rooftop solar, which I know there's some interest in among this group. This is the Bullitt Center, the rooftop solar there. Here, yeah, that's Seattle. You can see the Space Needle in the distance. So we should be maximizing the potential,
Horizon has this probably in.
Oh, really? Yeah, I bet you're right. I didn't even think to look. So we should really be maximizing rooftop solar to minimize how much new transmission that we need to build, because if we generate our electricity closer to where we're using it, we don't need those long power lines. I forget the exact numbers, but Oregon and Washington can each, a study found, generate about a third of their electricity from rooftop solar. Might be a little bit less than that, but that's still a pretty significant percentage, and we are not close to that right now. We also can be maximizing energy efficiency so that we're not using as much electricity, can also upgrade our existing lines to make sure that they can, transmit just as much as they can. But the truth is, no matter what, we are going to need some new transmission. Every study shows it. To bring us back to zoom out a little bit to the national story, I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act at the beginning of the presentation. A study from some Princeton modelers found recently that 80% of the promised emission reductions of the Inflation Reduction Act will be completely erased if we stay on pace at our current rate of transmission build out. So in other words, we've been building transmission in this country at about 1% per year. If we stay on that trajectory, the vast majority of the emission reduction promises will just completely evaporate. We're not going to, that law will not achieve its full potential. We actually need to triple the rate that study found, up to 3% a year. So in any case, we should be doing everything we can to minimize just how much we need transmission, but under any scenario where we're getting down to zero emissions electricity, we need more transmission. So here in the Northwest, there's a few things that we can do, if you're interested. The first one is that I was pretty shocked when I started researching this topic that there is currently no plan in the Northwest around transmission. I kept looking around, where's the plan, where's the plan? There is no plan. So we need, I think, ideally, an interregional plan between Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Idaho that looks at exactly how much transmission do we need? Because again, we know there's a backlog, but we don't know exactly how much transmission we need, nor do we know where it should go exactly so that we can mitigate some of those potential negative impacts, build it in the smartest way possible, and then decide who should build it and who should pay for it. So that would be a first step and seems like a no-brainer, and it should be a 20-year plan. Now the utilities, if you went to them and said, where's the plan? They would say, oh, well, we have a plan. They have a 10-year plan. I've read it. It doesn't really count as a plan, I don't think. They basically, each utility and BPA each have their own plan and they smush it all together and then they say, here's the regional plan. But we need something that actually takes as its starting point the laws that we've put in place in this region around climate and works backwards from there, not forwards from what the utilities are doing. And the other thing about that plan is that the Northwest policymakers, who are our climate leaders, have been pretty much sidelined from that process. So they're not involved in that planning process. They are starting to become more involved, is what I'm hearing, but for the most part, it's been a kind of utility and BPA show in terms of that. So we need to change that. That's sort of square one. The second thing that we can do is we can ask our elected officials to pressure BPA. So as I said before, BPA is a federal entity, so it makes it kind of an interesting beast in the Northwest. What that means is it's not under the jurisdiction of any state leadership. They don't report to Governor Inslee or the legislature. The closest thing they have to kind of a governing body is the Northwest Congressional Delegation. So our senators and congresspeople function sort of as a de facto board of BPA. Now, historically, they have mostly talked to BPA about the dams and the other mandate that BPA has, which is to protect fish and wildlife, given some of the harms of the dams. But historically, they haven't really focused on this transmission side of BPA. So a starting point would be to raise what next time you see your senator or a congressperson, to ask them to ask BPA, what are you doing about this transmission backlog? Even that would be a place to start. Another idea of what we could do here is we could start to learn from other states. So as I said earlier, most transmission is owned by utilities, and it's built by utilities usually. Here we have BPA. But other states have looked at some interesting examples of actually doing public financing and public build-out. Perhaps surprisingly, Texas has a very interesting example. In 2005, they decided that they were going to build out a lot more transmission to tap into their wind power. And they did do that. It was fairly expensive, but they now are the #1 wind generating state in the country. And they generate more wind than the next 3 states combined because of that. And they couldn't have done that without all that transmission. Colorado and New Mexico also have explored some state-level transmission planning. Those are not as far along, but something that we could look into here. I don't know if those would work, given the particularities of the Pacific Northwest and our electricity markets here, but it's something to learn from, I think. And then lastly, we've heard that Governor Inslee may be introducing a bill in this upcoming legislative session, which starts in January, around transmission. We don't know exactly what it will entail yet, but assuming it includes some good things, we'll be supporting that. And this, I guess, is a good segue to say that if you're interested in learning more about that as we get more information, you can sign up for Sightline's Clean Energy and Anti-Fossil Fuel newsletter, which is a free newsletter. So if you're interested after the talk, I have some clipboard somewhere and we'll be updating people who are interested in learning more about that. So I'm sure others have ideas as well about what we can do, so I'll leave it at that, and hopefully you have some questions or thoughts to share as well. Thank you.
Sherry has the microphone. Walk all the way over there. And so I get this is an opportunity for you to sign up for getting information from Sightline. If I can get the info.
What you don't have on there is the difference between BPA and the TVA. BPA was created later and has many more restrictions because of conservative lawmakers and power companies that put a lot of restrictions on BPA.
Interesting. Yeah, I think TVA that's the Tennessee Valley Authority, is probably the closest parallel to BPA, but I haven't done a comparison of the two, so it'd be interesting.
Radically different.
Interesting, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, done.
Very interesting. One question is, what are the assumptions in that calculation about rooftop solar potential? Because there's a lot of land area. There's also community solar, which can, has the same nice feature that it's close by. So you save money on transmission. It's not quite as efficient collecting the sun here in the west, but there must be a trade-off in that. I'm just wondering where that limit.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't do that analysis. It's a different study, but I could find it and I could send it to you, Jean, if you want to pass it along. I have that data. I'm not sure the assumptions they use, though. So Mike.
Yeah. Well, because I'm right here.
Yes.
I'm also interested in what's the potential for conservation. Just because I continue to feel like, are we going to be able to conserve enough just to say, like, make up for the number of people projected to move into this area in the next 20 years? Mm-hmm. So, can we keep one line steady? Or not, because I just feel like there's still got to be so much conservation opportunity in the current built environment? I mean, I know going forward, but 90% of us don't live in new construction. Something like that. Okay, thanks.
And you mean conservation like in terms of energy efficiency, like saving energy?
Yeah. In other words, just, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that is, I mean, that's kind of the other big pillar. And actually, BPA has been tasked with energy efficiency as one of its big mandates is making sure that it's using the bare minimum. But I do think that that's critical. I think that, again, as much as we can reduce how much electricity that we're using so that we don't have to have this huge, huge build out, because it does have some trade-offs associated with it. So I don't have a number behind that, but I think it's an important point.
Even the transmission is very inefficient from what I read.
Yeah.
Besides transmission for solar and wind, storage is a problem. Is there any way that we can fix that?
Yeah, storage is an exciting thing, I think, and that facility that I showed that had the wind and the solar and storage, I think is an example of innovation in that realm. I'm hoping that we'll continue to see storage capacity increase, so that that also helps mitigate how much transmission you need, because you can store more of it, of the energy. And I know storage costs are dropping and capacity is increasing. So I think the trends are heading in the right direction on that one.
How does the storage work? Hold up, Marcia.
Is high voltage DC on some of the lines practical, or is it nearly impossible?
Oh, you're getting out of my realm of expertise into electrical engineering, and I don't I don't know, but that's a good question. I've heard somebody mention that as an idea, but I don't know.
Well, you get a lot of higher voltage, but it costs money. That's the big problem. New equipment.
Yeah, I don't know, unfortunately, the answer to that. You were asking about, what was your question?
How does the storage, how are they storing?
How do they store it? I don't know. I think each one is different. There are different proposals for how you can store energy, and some of it is batteries, and I think there's questions about that as well in terms of the minerals that are used for batteries.
But they say they have stopped using the wind turbine because they're generating too much. They're generating too much energy.
That's right.
That actually.
Well, it's not exactly that they're generating too much. It's more that the grid can't handle it. And so if we had a more efficient and well-connected and built-out grid, then that electricity that's made, with a wind turbine, let's say in Montana, it wouldn't just get shut off. It would get sent to another place that needs electricity at that time of day. But because we have this kind of fragmented and underbuilt and aging grid, that doesn't happen. So there was a case, I think a few months ago, where renewable energy prices were actually negative because they had to basically shut off because they didn't have grid capacity to get online.
Okay, over here.
I'm wondering, build the lines. Can you hear me?
Something funny happening with the microphone. Do you want to use this one?
I think I got it.
Okay.
All right. I'm wondering when they build the lines,
Yeah.
are the lines ever broken down by the weather or by wildfires or other things like that? And is it more efficient to bury the lines rather than putting them up in the air?
Right, yeah, so if people didn't hear the question, it was about whether there are risks to the lines, including wind or wildfires, and whether it's more efficient to bury the lines. There definitely are risks. I think there was a case in California where PG&E, I'm from California, they had some lines at risk from wildfires, definitely. There's actually an interesting proposal that some folks have that it's called, I'll have to remember the name of the project, but it basically is actually trying to run a transmission line under the Columbia River. Now, there's people who are concerned about the other potential impacts of that, so I really can't say what the trade-off would be, but it's certainly something people are looking at too, as another, partly because it is very controversial and difficult to build these big lines, and they're kind of an eyesore. I kind of like them. I get excited when I see them, but other people don't. Yeah, so anyway, it's something that people are looking into, but I don't know the pros and cons, like how you trade it off. I'm not sure.
Hi, well, we in the Northwest are ahead of the game completely from the beginning because we have a lot of stored energy behind dams. And hydroelectric has made us that's pure and it's not contaminating the other climate. How we stand on that? Are we getting better, or where is it like we had a bad year for rain here?
Yeah. Well, hydro is so interesting because it has meant that a lot of our electricity is carbon free in the Northwest. And that's fantastic and puts us ahead of the game, as you said, for climate. There's also, as I'm sure folks are aware, other challenges associated with dams, especially around the salmon, and tribal rights. So they're not 100% perfect, but from a climate perspective, they're helpful. In terms of, but I don't think there's any new dams that are going to be built. Those are all built around back in the New Deal era, or a little bit more recently, partly too. But because of some of those controversies, I don't see us adding any more hydropower. And then there's this added question, as you're saying, of rainfall and potentially rising droughts. So I think that's a real risk that we have to think about. And when I was talking about the need for a 20-year plan, that's a kind of thing that should be in the plan, looking at, well, what do we actually think the rainfall projections are going to be? And that's hard to do, but 20 years from now, how much electricity are we really going to be getting from hydro? Is that going to be dropping? It probably will be dropping somewhat. And so what does that mean about where we're getting electricity from?
There's one other idea that's tossed around, and that's hydrogen, because in principle, the gas pipelines could be reconditioned for hydrogen, and the gas power plants could also utilize hydrogen. So if you have wind and solar generating hydrogen instead of direct electricity, that could be another way to ship it around. And it could be, now you have all the fossil fuel interests, which will put a bollocks on that, but I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Actually, I think the fossil fuel companies are kind of excited about hydrogen, which makes me a little bit more skeptical. But there definitely is a role for hydrogen in decarbonizing the entire economy, but its specific uses, industrial uses, for example, that makes sense. Like basically things that are hard to electrify, that's where hydrogen starts to make sense. If you remember those two pillars I was talking about earlier, electrify everything, there's a few things that are hard to electrify, like making cement, for example, or steel. But it's interesting that you brought up the natural gas companies, because they are starting to say, oh, well, we could just pipe hydrogen through the gas pipelines, that are under the city, for example. But that is not, I don't think that's a good idea for a lot of reasons. They can only blend a very small percentage of hydrogen into the pipelines. I think it's something like 10%. Before they have to actually replace the entire pipeline. So they're sort of saying, oh, well, look, we've got all these pipelines, we can just put hydrogen in it, but that's not exactly true. They would have to spend billions of dollars to rebuild those pipes, and that doesn't make sense for things that have a much easier solution, like heating our homes or cooking, for example, where we're using gas right now, but there's an easy electric alternative. So I'm sort of mixed on hydrogen. It depends on the use.
Well, I mean, you're going to spend billions in years, decades.
Use the mic, Tom.
Sorry. you already have on the one hand billions of dollars in years on transmission development. If you've got the pipelines, you could replace the pipes perhaps for a similar cost. I don't know.
Well, I think it'd be cheaper though to just electrify things than, I don't think it would be comparable price-wise.
No, the issue is how to get the energy from where it's generated to the consumer, and their gas pipelines might have an advantage.
Okay, so now the bubbles are percolating in my head here. So I'm trying to think, of course in the former East Germany, they heated all their buildings from central heating sources. And they were basically running steam radiators to all their high-rise buildings that they were building after the war. And I always feel like in the United States, people live more dispersed until more recently, because now we've got this densification occurring in urban areas. So that's the first thing. We weren't living in that same kind of pattern. And then the second thing, we've had so much emphasis on doing everything individually rather than communally. So is there any chance of providing heat to people in that way, rather than having to worry about transmitting so much electricity to, at least for spatial heating spaces?
Yeah, it's Gina and I were just talking about a similar idea actually. So there's this cool idea. I haven't looked into it too deeply yet to be able to definitively say yes, this is an excellent idea. But it's a group out of Massachusetts has been doing some pilots of this thing that they're calling the geogrid. And basically what it is they looked at Massachusetts and they said, look, we've got these really old gas pipelines and we're gonna have to replace them anyway because they're gonna become dangerous as they're aging. We actually have that going on here in Washington too, not as old, but still some leaky pipelines. In any case, they're saying, what if instead of spending the money on replacing with new gas pipelines, which will then last another 50 years and we're supposed to be off of gas by then, what if we use the same right of way and instead you piped water through the pipelines and shared the heat that's generated, basically it's using ground source heating, and it transfers energy between the buildings, and you can do it kind of at a neighborhood scale and then expand from there. I think it's very cool. Again, there's a few gas utilities in Massachusetts that are trying this out, and I think the benefit of it partly is that it creates an opportunity also for the gas utility, because it could use the same workforce, same skill set, and that offers kind of a just transition opportunity rather than right now where the gas utilities are kind of scrambling because they know they have no future and they're spreading misinformation or false solutions. And anyway, New York State actually last year, or maybe it was this past legislative session, they passed a law requiring pilots of this same idea. So I'm looking into it here in Washington to see if there's maybe potential as well. I haven't heard of anybody doing it here, but it's something that maybe could be interesting. And, that's another plug to sign up for our newsletters, because I'm planning to write an article about that actually in the next couple of months. So if you're interested in learning more.
Can you tell us again what Texas did? There's 3 times this.
Sure. Yeah, so in 2005,
Repeat the question.
The question was asking about what Texas did with their transmission. So in 2005, the legislature basically directed the Public Utility Commission to look into how it could expand its transmission. And I forget exactly the details, but basically they built out a ton of more transmission to tap into the wind in the western part of the state. And they increased their wind power, they tripled it as a result of it. It cost, I believe, $17 billion. I have the numbers in my transmission article. And that was paid for by ratepayers. So that, I think that's challenging from a cost standpoint. But at the same time, it did really help to increase their renewable power, and they are the #1 wind generating state in the country, and highest by far. They're generating more wind than the next 3 states combined. Yeah.
It may have been more available, but it was not cheaper. Texas has a screwed up power system where you pay more when you use more, and people 2 years ago got in serious trouble because of the power plant.
Oh yeah, no, Texas, I'm not suggesting that we should do everything that Texas is doing by any stretch of the imagination. And as you said, they had major and deadly blackouts, which were pinned on by some people on renewables, but actually it was the natural gas failures. But so I don't think it's like, oh, their grid is amazing. It's more an example of the state getting ahead of this problem and saying, we have these resources, how do we tap into them, and let's build out ahead of that. So I think there's lessons to be learned there, if not, directly copying.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for all these great questions.
Still lots of questions probably, and we'll allow people to go home if they need to. Otherwise, come up and pester Emily with questions. If there's anybody who is interested in getting one of these newsletters and hasn't signed up for it, we have another board over there that I will pick up.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.